when it comes to certain fundamental properties of nature, such as that time is not absolute, and that at the subatomic level that particles take on a wavy, dualistic character, and a particle can be in several places at once. Those behaviors of nature contradict our common experience. So the senses, when you get to very high speeds, relative speeds, or very small sizes, our senses give us an inaccurate intuition or understanding of nature.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Our guest today on the Into the Impossible podcast, a man who, on his last episode, I called him astronomy's Tolstoy. He didn't object. Maybe he didn't watch the episode, but I really believe it, Alan. I've been in love with your books and your way of thinking for 30 plus years now, since Einstein's Dreams. And actually, no, that's a lie. Before that, your best book, the book that's changed my life more than any book, perhaps, that I've read of yours, or maybe any others. It's a page turner. It's called The Problem Book in Relativity and Gravitation. Yeah. And it came out when I was in grad school, or just before I started grad school, I think. And it's in multiple printings. It is one of the best books ever written. I actually just saw Bill Press recently, who is your co-author. He's a great guy. I'm going to send him this interview when we're done. And Alan Lightman, thank you for joining us today on the Into the Impossible podcast for your second appearance.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be on your program.
I love your books, and there's no difference, no change in my opinion after this wonderful new book that your folks were kind enough to send to me in both written, printed hard copy, in PDF, and in audio format. Wow. And I loved all three. I read all three versions. It's lovingly and tenderly illustrated with great pictures of guys that look like this and other characters we're going to talk about, including my hero Galileo Galilei, and even Sir Roger Penrose, where I will reconnect to the book I just mentioned, A Problem Book in Gravity and Relativity. So stay tuned for that. We're talking today is St. Patrick's Day. You're in the city that's most closely associated with this phenomena of St. Patrick's Day, as I remember it, which is Boston, Massachusetts, just outside slightly. Mm-hmm. And I have a connection to this day in Boston because 8 years ago, I can't believe it, my team and I announced the nominal discovery of the cosmic microwave background inflationary B-mode polarization signal. Actually, it was 9 years ago. I mistweeted today. I sent out a tweet. I got to correct my own tweet. But the discovery was announced, and it heralded a new way of thinking about the universe. Mm-hmm. In that the universe began not only with a Big Bang, not only with an inflationary epoch, but according to your colleague Max Tegmark, it was unequivocal evidence for the multiverse, which makes an appearance in this book as well. Well,
I totally disagree with that conclusion.
As I thought you would. So this wonderful new book is called The Transcendent Brain. Brain. Sorry, I always get that mixed. My mom says she named me that specifically so that people would make that mistake. And actually, we have an interview that'll probably be out. Yes, it will be out by the time you're watching this video with Alan, and it's with my colleague Alison Mottry, who is growing organoids, brain organoids in outer space on the International Space Station. And we're going to get to that in this conversation and your thoughts on the future of brain technology, of human mind-machine interfacing with folks like Elon Musk's Neuralink, et cetera, and your colleague Noam Chomsky, who I've spoken to on the podcast before. But the reason I bring this up is because Allison, when he was on the podcast, we were coordinating, and he wrote me and he called me Brain. And I just thought it was so funny because he's a brain scientist. So now I've got an official recognition that a brain scientist thinks that I actually have a brain. This book is an incredible tour de force, and it's very much unlike your other books. And first thing I want to ask you, as I ask all my esteemed guests, I don't know if I asked you this 2 years ago when I interviewed you for the first time, but we've started a new segment on the podcast, and it's called Judging Books by Their Covers. So you're never supposed to judge a book by their cover, but what other Bayesian priors do you have? So the way I do it is I ask the author to describe the cover illustration, the title, and the subtitle, and what went into it. And most of the time it's that my publisher forced me to do it, but I don't think they can have that much leverage over intellect like you. So, Alan, please help us judge this wonderful book by its cover.
Well, I can talk about the title first. The subtitle, Spirituality in the Age of Science, sort of nails the subject matter. And the main title, The Transcendent Brain, is supposed to be a little bit more poetic and metaphorical, but just suggests that the brain is capable of really amazing phenomena and experiences. The image on the cover, I don't know what to say about that. That was chosen by the publisher. I'm not at all unhappy with that image, but so be it.
And the subtitle is Spirituality in the Age of Science. So those are two words that don't usually go harmoniously together. So what was that? Was that a hurdle to get past your editors and publisher?
No, I've been writing about this subject for some years. This book was intended to be sort of a codification of what I've been writing about before. So my editor at Random House was willing to go with me on that journey to put spirituality next to science, because he understands the way that I mean that. And my view of spirituality is such that the two, that is completely consistent with a scientific view of the world. Mm-hmm. So he understands that.
Very good. So this book has so much in it, and I want to take it from the standpoint of sort of steelmanning an opposite perspective that I have. I've mentioned to you last time that I'm a practicing Jew. I'm not an Orthodox Jew, but I attend synagogue and temple. I learn Hebrew. I read the Old Testament, the Torah, the Bible, in the original Hebrew, and can get my way around the Talmud in Aramaic. And I'm often, kind of chastised by that. We've had on some of the militant atheists. Well, we haven't had on the new atheists that you talk about the most, and you, in fact, had a very, very intense skirmish with. It's described at the end of the book with Richard Dawkins. But Richard Dawkins wrote the foreword to one of my previous guests, who was a scholar at MIT at one time, Lawrence Krauss. And he wrote a foreword to the Universe from Nothing book, and he called it basically the cosmological equivalent of On the Origin of Species, which I even think that Lawrence was embarrassed by. But nevertheless, when I had Lawrence on, I was sort of struck, and I've been on his podcast as well. I've been struck by how little the scientific community understands or even appreciates about religion. Not only, obviously not from a believer's perspective, but are you, kind of surprised by how little someone like a Dawkins, or, for example, Lawrence Krauss did not know the origin, and he's a Jew. I mean, he was born Jewish, and he's not practicing, but obviously, but he had a bar mitzvah, which I didn't have, and so he's educated. I asked him, Lawrence, do you know the meaning of the word Israel in the Jewish language? Do you know the meaning of the word Jew in Hebrew, which is the language of Judaism? No, he didn't know anything. And so I was struck, and I told him this. I'm like, Lawrence, you've got a great mind, but you're accepting the word of a 13-year-old, and you're just taking that word. And he's like, which 13-year-old? I said, you. When you were 13, you gave up on ever studying religion again, as most Jewish boys do. And I know you were born Jewish too, but I don't believe you're practicing. What do you make of the level of knowledge and rigor that scientists approach or grapple with the question of religion? Is it sufficient?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you. Yeah, sorry for the long-winded question.
Yes. Well, I think everybody should, not just scientists, but everybody should know about the history of religion and the meaning of religion. I mean, of course, there are many religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. I think that everybody should have some understanding of those religions and their origins, and a little bit about their cultural history, because religion and science are the two greatest forces that have shaped our civilization, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't understand the history of religion and the cultural significance of religion, then you really have a big gap in your understanding of who we are and who our society is. So that's my view. I don't know whether scientists are any more ignorant of religion than other people, but I do think we should all understand religion. And I think that you asked about, you said that Lawrence Krauss didn't know the meaning of the word Israel. Doesn't it mean something like grappling with God, or?
Yeah, it means wrestling or fighting with God, against God, meaning, and in contradistinction, I should point out to Islam, which means submission to God. And I feel like people and I told Lawrence, I said, you're actually an Israelite because you, for all the, vitriol that you and Richard Dawkins kind of espouse towards religious practitioners, you nevertheless are wrestling with God on a daily basis.
Yeah, well, I don't think that my interpretation of that wrestling with God is not that you are necessarily fighting or denying the existence of God, but that you are you're trying to understand God's place in the cosmos. Just, as the Talmud, as you mentioned, has these dialogues and conversations that we're trying to understand. So that's my interpretation of that phrase.
Yeah, I think the beauties of a religion that is open to questioning and
yes.
is that and the basis of the religion is really this kind of struggle and kind of, in contrast, as I say, it's in contradistinction to other religions that view it as a higher motive to have belief. In the case of Christianity, and just pure faith. Or Islam, which has, the submission to God as its catechism or its main pillar of faith. I had on the podcast, my very first guest was a near and dear friend. It was Freeman Dyson. And I love Freeman, and he used to spend his his winters out here because I guess Princeton, New Jersey isn't the greatest place to do one's time in the middle of winter. And La Jolla is pretty nice. And he'd come over and we talk, and he was the first guest on the podcast. I asked him in that podcast, I said, Freeman, you call yourself an agnostic, but what does that mean? Because it seems to me, I asked him, do you go to church on Sundays? No, I don't do that. Do you read the scriptures? And he had won the Templeton Prize, and he had been kind of embarrassed by that. In fact, he told Martin Rees, we talked about this on the podcast I did with Martin in October. He said, Martin, I'm so glad you won the Templeton Prize because now there's someone who deserves it even less than I did.
Hey friends, just a quick request while you're enjoying this video to leave a thumbs up. My thumb's a little bit preoccupied with all Carl Sagan over here, but I hope yours is free enough to leave a like. It really helps me with the algorithm. And for extra credit homework assignment, leave a comment down below what you're enjoying about this video. Now back to the show.
But Freeman, he's such a mischievous mind. The title of his biography is Science Rebel, a rebel of science. So anyway, I said, Freeman, how would someone intelligent alien looking at you and looking at Richard Dawkins, how would they distinguish between the two of you? You both don't go to the same church and you both don't study the same. So how do you define this notion of spiritual but not religious? What does that mean? And how do you, I'm a behaviorist, so how do you instantiate that in your life?
Yeah. Well, I think an alien all they would need to do is to learn the English language, which I think they could do in 5 minutes, and read the articles and books that those people have written, and they could see a very clear difference between them. So
when I take it you practice more of a Buddhist tradition, or do you have?
I'm Jewish, like you, and we do observe the Jewish holidays, but I also have a lot of admiration for Buddhism. I don't believe in rebirth, which is part of Buddhism, but I do like many of the tenets of Buddhism, such as being present in the moment and trying to detach the ego from things that we do and the temporary nature of existence. All of that is something I subscribe to.
Mm-hmm. When we spoke last, we spoke a lot about Einstein and obviously for Einstein's dreams. And it's just, it's one of the books I recommend most to people when I'm asked to give a book recommendation of the probably 1,000 books I've had the chance to read over the course of my life.
you.
And one of the, obviously Einstein is the main character, and I've really kind of two questions about Einstein. He doesn't really appear very much in this book. He's in there, and we'll get to kind of some of the aspects in which you connect to him. But in the conception of him as a man of faith, or perhaps an atheist, it seems his ambiguity spread like, a Schrodinger cat-like state. He was maybe purposely ambiguous. Was he religious? Was he not? What's your take? And do we make too much of like trying to ape our heroes and emulate them? What was Einstein's take on spirituality, if not religion?
Well, we actually know what his take is because a journalist asked him that. I think it was around 1933. Point blank, are you an atheist? And Einstein said, no, I'm not an atheist. And then he said, I think that the question being the existence or non-existence of God is too big a question for our little minds. And then he went on to elaborate a little bit. He said that I view our connection to the cosmos as a child who walks into a huge library, a very large library, and looks around and sees lots and lots of books written in foreign tongues and knows that somebody wrote those books, but they don't know who, and they can't read them. And during his lifetime, Einstein tossed off various flip comments like God doesn't play dice and things like that. And I don't think that those comments represented his real religious views, but I do think that his answer to this journalist in 1933 did represent his actual views.
And we hear about, his famous quote about kind of the Spinozan God, the God of Spinoza, who, kind of is manifest in the unity of all things.
But impersonal.
Impersonal, yeah. So that not intervening, that still leaves open. I mean, in Judaism, not to give a theology lecture, but, God has really two main purposes: to start the universe, which is, our domain in cosmology, perhaps, but then to be a personal God, right? Not to be the unmoved mover of Aristotle, etc. So I want to pivot from Einstein to an earlier generation, and that was the man that Einstein called one of the greatest contributors to Western civilization, essentially, and that was Galileo. And I actually had the honor with your fellow MIT colleague, Frank Wilczek, to record the first ever audiobook by Galileo, and it's the Dialogue on Two World Systems, which is the Copernicus and the Aristotelian kind of doing battle. And Frank Wilczek narrated the introduction by Albert Einstein to this book. And I read the voice of one of the characters, Carlo Rovelli, read another one. And I was really struck by the kind of visceral nature that Galileo had. And he was greatly admired by Einstein, obviously. And he talked about the visual kind of impression. And you show in the book this famous woodcut from Siderius Nuncius. And you also show a picture of his telescope. And you actually went there. And I went to Arcetri just a few months ago. I was in his prison. I don't know if you actually went to his final imprisonment place. But
no, I didn't see that.
But you talk about the fact that looking at the moon, which was previously thought to be smooth, perfect, crystalline, he said, anyone would then understand, Galileo said, with the certainty of the senses, that the moon is by no means endowed with a smooth and polished surface, but is rough and uneven. And then you talk about a letter in 1812 to an Italian scientist. And of course, he was wrapped up in religion. He was very deeply religious. This kind of bespeaks of the next kind of section I want to get into, which is the interface between the physical and the spiritual. And a lot of that is appreciated via the sense of sight. And the Torah is very skeptical about the eyes. The Shema, which is like the catechism, the Our Father of Judaism, says, do not stray after your eyes. They cause you to whore yourself, to be a prostitute to your eyes. To what extent should we trust the visual sensations, the appreciation, as a way that Galileo did to prove things, whether scientific or spiritual?
Well, of course, one thing that we've learned from modern science, which you know as well as I do, is that the 20th century science, especially 20th century physics, has shown us that our senses lead us astray when it comes to certain fundamental properties of nature, such as that time is not absolute, and that at the subatomic level that particles take on a wavy, dualistic character, and a particle can be in several places at once. Those behaviors of nature contradict our common experience. So the senses, when you get to very high speeds, relative speeds, or very small sizes, our senses give us an inaccurate intuition or understanding of nature. In terms of spirituality, well, it's a great question, because the experiences that I call spiritual, for example, looking up at a starry night and feeling connected to the cosmos, or making eye contact with a wild animal, or feeling connected to nature. Those experiences may originate with the senses, but ultimately they are mental experiences. And so when you say, you ask whether we should trust our senses, I think that in the physical world, that we can trust our senses for most things that we experience in daily life. In the spiritual world, I think that the essence of the experiences are not sensory, that they are mental, and that the senses may be triggers to the feelings that we call spiritual feelings, but ultimately it's not about the senses.
Mm-hmm. And you explore in the next chapter, or in a later chapter, you start to encounter a man that I briefly knew at Caltech, Christoph Koch, who's now, I believe, up in Washington, Seattle area. And you kind of get into the real application of modern scientific tools and apparatus in terms of the understanding of consciousness. And I haven't had him on. I'm hoping to get him on eventually. The problem is he wrote his book so long ago. It's not likely he's going to get that patented Keating bump that you'll surely enjoy, and it will pay for another beach house in Maine someday for you, Alan. You can send me an invitation. So, but you talk about kind of the computational aspects of the mind, and I wonder, of the different perspectives that are explored, of the 4 or 5 major perspectives that you explore, is one more convincing or less convincing? We'll get to some comments by past guests, Donald Hoffman and Roger Penrose in just a bit. But what was Koch's, like, when you look at the modern application and the breakthroughs that they've had, I still come away feeling like we still don't know what it's like to be a bat. We still right. I've had on now I'm blanking on his name at NYU is the progenitor David Chalmers. I've had him on.
Yeah.
We did an episode. It's still the hard problem. So, yes. I mean, it doesn't seem to be getting any easier. I wonder, is it just too hard? This computer on our shoulders, if it is a computer, which I don't think it is, and Penrose doesn't think it is, will we ever be able to answer the most basic questions? And to the extent we can't answer, what is it like to be a bat, say, what hope is there to understand the deeper origins of consciousness? Yeah.
Well, it's a wonderful question. And I agree with you that we're a long way from understanding how consciousness emerges from the brain. But I think that it's perfectly reasonable to take the position that consciousness and all of our mental sensations, consciousness, of course, being the fundamental mental sensation, it's perfectly reasonable to take the point of view that all of those mental experiences ultimately originate in the material neurons in the brain. Even if we cannot fill in all the blanks to get from those material neurons to the really incredible, extraordinary, unique sensation of consciousness, we can still believe that its origin is material even though we can't fill in all the blanks to say how that gets to this incredible first-person subjective experience we call consciousness. I totally agree that we don't know what it feels like to be a bat. We don't know what it feels like to be a computer. Most people in AI, including Chris Koch, believe that any finite list of attributes that you associate with consciousness, any finite list of manifestations of consciousness, and you say, this is the sign of consciousness, that we will someday be able to build a computer that checks all the boxes. But whether or not we will know that that entity is conscious or not, that's a different question. Because to know that, you have to really know what it feels like to be a computer.
Yeah.
We don't know what it feels like to be a dolphin or what it feels like to be a crow. And surely consciousness, whatever it is a graded phenomena. An amoeba is almost certainly not conscious, but a crow and a dolphin have exhibited behavior that we associate with consciousness. They have some level of consciousness, not equal to humans, perhaps. But even with those other animals, the dolphins and crows, we don't know what it feels like to be a dolphin or a crow.
Right. Or
it's conceivable to me that someday in the distant future, we may understand brain science well enough that we can implant a chip in our brain that somehow connects our neurons to the neurons of a dolphin or a crow. It seems that in principle that's not ruled out. And if that's ever possible, then we may begin to know what it feels like to be a dolphin or a crow.
And I want to use that as a springboard to try on you a thought experiment, a Gedanken experiment, as our good friend Albert would say. I'm looking for my finger puppet. Someday I'll have a finger puppet of you somewhere. Oh, no, this is not him. This is Newton. This is Galileo. So we were talking about Galileo. He'll have to stand in for Einstein, the old one. So Einstein said as happiest thought. It's like when I talked to David Chalmers, I said, I have to ask you to define the hard problem, because it would be like I had on ABBA, another famous product of Australia where David Chalmers is from. I said, it'd be like I have ABBA on the podcast and I don't ask him to sing Dancing Queen. So I said, David, define the hard problem. I can't resist you to define to remind my audience what Einstein called his happiest thought.
Well, I think that he meant by that his happiest thought was to realize that gravity is equivalent to acceleration. Am I right about that?
Yeah, and he envisioned the Gedanken experiment was that if he was in free fall, he'd experience no gravitational acceleration. So I want to use that to pivot to what you just said. We can't know what it's like to be Einstein. We can't know but can a computer, A, have a happiest thought? What does that even mean? And B, can it experience a thought based on a thought experiment based on a visceral sensation of free fall? I think it's totally impossible, but I'm curious what you might say.
Well, of course, a computer could have sensory input. I mean, you could, in fact, in the public television series that I was involved with, I have a conversation with an advanced android, and she has photo cells where she can see me. She has earphones where she can hear me, and she can interpret those sounds in terms of language, which then reflect back on her vast database. So I think that we can build a computer that has sensory input into the computer. What was the
sensory input and then happiness?
Have a happiest thought.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you have to define what thinking is to answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
And we could define thinking as taking certain information as input and then having some output. And if you define thinking in that way or some way that's equivalent to that, certainly we can build a computer that can think.
Mm.
I mean, it may be more complicated than that. Happiness. Well, I'm deconstructing your statement, happiest thought. So first we talked about thinking, now we talk about happy, which is an emotion. And could a computer have an emotional state?
Yes.
That seems to me a harder one than whether it can think. You could probably put artificial tear ducts on a computer and make it cry. You could have a robotic arm and it could shake its fist at you out of anger. But I don't know whether we will be able to build a computer that truly has emotions. That's a tough one.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It seems almost impossible. And pivoting from one Nobel Prize winner to another, which is Sir Roger Penrose, who's talked about quite a good deal and respectful and quite interesting terms. And his collaboration with Stuart Hameroff emerged from his book, The Emperor's New Mind, which was actually the first popular science book I ever read. And he honored me by putting his name on this book, and behind me, my Losing the Nobel Prize book. He endorsed that book a long time ago. But the reason that book made such an impact on me is because it really portrayed the future as being incredibly exciting and first defining what computation is, and then ultimately being ambiguous and uncertain as to whether or not at that point computation was what was really the essence of consciousness. Right. And later with Hameroff, who I've interviewed both of them, and we'll have links to those interviews above. I interviewed them, the two of them, and they really maintain that not only is consciousness not a computational or amenable to pure computation via basically an abstract analogy from Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which we can refer people to my chats with him, but that consciousness is actually instantiated via some gravitational interaction with this classical GR phenomenon. So it's not even a quantum phenomenon. It has to do with the Weyl curvature, et cetera. So I'm going to ask you to hearken back to that first book, problem book on gravity and general relativity. What do you make of their theory? Microtubules are quantum phenomena that interact with the classical gravitational field. I don't believe it for 1 minute. Why is that?
And I think that it was roundly dismissed by neuroscientists, that book and his thesis. Well, Roger Penrose, of course, understands all of physics much more than I do, including quantum physics. But I'll just say the elementary thing, that the fundamental unit of action in the brain is the neuron. And of course, we know that each neuron is connected to between 1,000 and 10,000 other neurons. And the neuron is not a quantum object. It's a macroscopic object, even though we can't see it with the naked eye. It's that a neuron has trillions and trillions of atoms in it. It's far beyond, the realm where quantum physics acts. There's no such thing as, you can't have entanglement or coherence between neighboring neurons because there's way too much noise in the brain, which would destroy any kind of, global entanglement or coherence. So I think it's absolutely, impossible that quantum physics or GR could play a role in the brain. Mm-hmm. So I don't, first acknowledging that Roger Penrose knows a lot more physics than I do. I just think that that's a crazy idea. And neuroscientists, as I said, roundly dismissed it. So I don't know what else to say about it. I mean, Penrose is a brilliant guy, and he's, came up with Penrose tiles and worked with Hawking on general relativity and all kinds of incredible discoveries. But I think he got into deep water on that book. Yeah,
he told me in person in the first interview I ever did about 5 years ago with him that, when he wrote the book, he thought and he hoped that he would get tons of written letters back then, 1989, from young people saying, "Oh, I'm so excited," and turned me on to science. And it did for me. I didn't write him a letter. But he said, no, he just got all these letters from old guys with, their own theories of consciousness and computation. But the one who was, I guess, middle-aged at the time, 30 plus years ago, was Stuart Hameroff, who's an anesthesiologist, who says, his greatest joy is, turning off consciousness. But that's a topic for another day. Roger, as you know, one of his books is called Faith and Fantasy in Physics. And the fantasy part, I don't know if you've read that book, it revolves around the concept of cosmological inflation. And cosmological inflation was pioneered by your collaborator and friend next door to you, if I remember correctly, or not too far away, Alan Guth, who went unconscious when I spoke there in 2016 at a colloquium. But I've heard he does that not infrequently.
He does that all the time. So you should. It's not personal.
Thank you, Alan. That salvages what's left of my ego. But I have a question here from another pioneer who's closely related not only to inflation, but to the inflationary multiverse, who's a big fan of your work. And his name is Andre Linde. And I wrote him this week to tell him he's coming on the podcast in a few weeks. And he agreed to come on the podcast, but he sent me, I asked him, do you have any thoughts about Alan? And his writing and his new book, which he hasn't seen, but he's also mentioned in your previous book, which we talked about last year. And I'll have a link to that awesome interview. Well, awesome guest. I don't know how good an interviewer I am, but anyway, he writes, "Dear Brian, I like Alan and I respect him very much. He is great and he writes beautifully. I did not know about the new book, so I don't know what he says about me, but I've seen his article in The Atlantic. It is wonderful. If I understand him correctly, he believes in spirituality, but assumes that is possible only in the presence of ordinary matter, like protons, atoms, or molecules. Mm-hmm. This is an economic assumption, and in science, we should always look for the simplest, most economical explanation of everything. However, since some people may have different assumptions in this respect, you may ask Alan if this is just an assumption, like a statement of faith." So that's the first question. Is this an assumption, this postulate that because there's matter always present and spirituality kind of is a software layer that runs on the hardware layer, the it from bit? Can you comment on that? Is this just an assumption, or can we actually, did you make this assumption basically for Occam's razor's purposes?
Certainly it's an assumption. I mean, all of science is an assumption. Science is a continuing endeavor to make better and better approximations about the behavior of the world. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But we make certain assumptions in science. For example, that the laws of physics that we observe on Earth are the same as the laws of physics in outer space. That laws have a universality. We assume that cause and effect relations. And we make the assumption that there are no additional forces or essences, ethereal essences beyond the atoms and molecules and energy that we observe and can quantify. We make that assumption. You can't prove that assumption.
Right.
I mean, that's why we call it an assumption.
Right. It's Lucretius, he's got a lot of citations to that paper.
Right. Yeah. So we can't prove it. Just the same way that science can't prove whether God doesn't exist, and religion can't prove that God does exist. That these are statements that we accept or reject on the basis of faith. And science makes the fundamental assumption of science, I think, is that the universe is orderly. Mm-hmm. That it obeys laws, and that in principle that human beings will eventually discover those laws, or at least very good approximations to those laws. Mm-hmm. And so yes, I think it's an assumption, and I agree with Andre said. It's an economical assumption, but it is an assumption.
So he has a follow-up question, and he does this by way of analogy. He says, before the invention of general relativity, everyone believed the gravitational field only appears in the presence of massive bodies. And this gravitational field does not have any independent degrees of freedom. But it turned out this belief was incorrect. In GR, one may have an evolving universe without any electrons and protons, filled by an oscillating gravitational field, gravitational waves, having their own degrees of freedom. Mm-hmm. Thus, space-time in GR is alive. It's not just a mathematical tool for describing behavior of ordinary matter. It has its own degrees of freedom, can evolve, propagate, even in the absence of matter. It took 100 years and billions of dollars since the invention of GR to observe gravitational waves by your colleague and past guest, Ray Weiss and Barry Barish, who's my co-author on my second book, Into the Impossible. Bicep tries to find gravitational my experiments of another type which may have existed since the Big Bang. So the essence of my question is whether it is possible at all with respect to consciousness, the subject of this magnificent book of yours, and spirituality, that we're just at the beginning of the place that physicists were at 100 years ago with respect to space-time, before Einstein and before the billions of dollars were spent. And he has a link to a paper that he wrote dedicated to John Wheeler 20 years ago. I'll send it to you later. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, if I can go back before I answer that question.
Yes.
When Lindy says that gravity can exist without the presence of matter, Einstein's theory, and even his theory of special relativity, which you know very well, is that matter and energy have some equivalence. And a gravitational wave has energy in it. So when Lindy says, can gravity exist without the presence of matter? It can exist without the presence of matter or energy, and a gravitational wave has energy in it. That's what makes the two mirrors on LIGO, oscillate back and forth. Mm-hmm. So the question whether we are in understanding consciousness, are we at the same stage that physicists were 100 years ago, or scientists? I don't know whether it's 100 years ago, but I certainly agree that we're at an infant's stage. We're in our infancy of understanding consciousness. We do know a lot about the brain. We know pretty much how neurons work, and we know how neurons send electricity, how electricity flows through individual neurons. We know how they communicate with each other with chemicals, neurotransmitters. But when you put 100 billion neurons together, each connected to 10,000 other neurons, or even if you put 1,000 neurons together, we can't even simulate 1,000 neurons. You get emergent phenomena. You get behavior of that system that you can't predict on the basis of individual neurons. And it might be a very long time before we understand how that qualitative behavior comes about.
Philip Anderson, coined the term, more is different, only in the 1950s, and that launched the field of, condensed matter physics. But, atoms and molecules have been around for, thousands of years since Lucretius, as we said. Turning to that kind of subjective experience, and you did mention, kind of this notion of perception. Another past guest on the podcast, Donald Hoffman, who's also spoken a lot about consciousness. You can tell I'm very interested in consciousness. I've had all these great minds and brains, and your contribution was not surprisingly influential on me, but it was not different enough for your perspective is different enough from, say, Hoffman's or even Penrose's, that I thought it would be interesting to get your take. So he asserts that there is a evolutionary, that what we experience as consciousness is basically evolutionary low-pass filtering, that we see reality as sort of a dashboard where there are icons, the icons of, PowerPoint or, Microsoft Excel. They look different. They represent different pointers in our neurons, and the emergence comes about as a sense of perception that's evolutionarily optimized for our benefit. In other words, we're conscious is just another level of perception, but there's nothing to say that, say, an osprey, which we'll talk a lot about in just a minute, but there's nothing that an osprey couldn't actually perceive, and perhaps not even the electrons in the screen might also have consciousness, so-called panpsychistic or panpsychism. What do you make of this? That consciousness, I hate asking these double-barrel questions, but we only have a few more minutes left. Double-barrel question is consciousness an evolutionary phenomenon, which would seem to me that an electron couldn't be conscious because they don't evolve. Let me just start with that, and then I'll pivot to selection.
Of course, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I do think it's very plausible that consciousness evolved, and that if you could go back to prior to Homo sapiens, go back, several million years, that you might find this pre-human, some member of the Homo genus that had a lower level of consciousness than what we have now. So I think that's very plausible that it evolved.
And then thinking about this evolutionary kind of experience that he talks about. Well, the taste of chocolate in this book, The Case Against Reality, talks about how the taste of chocolate might have evolved to imprints such that it's really one and the same. Like we experience red, perhaps it's different, but every time I see red and you see red, it might be different, but we agree that it's redness to us, and that the taste of chocolate is really just the conscious experience. And there's no absolute taste of chocolate.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah.
So, thinking of coffee and chocolate, and that I'm having here with my Irish, addition because it's St. Patrick's Day, right, Alan? So you got to Irish up the coffee for the professor before I start to teach. I thought a lot in this book about there are maybe unintentionally a lot of Judaic themes that run through it, and we've talked a little bit about that. But as I said, one of the things that Lawrence Krauss and the other self-described militant atheists didn't know, what does the word Jew mean? Where does his name come from? I think it's very important. I was having lunch with a very good friend who's Persian, and I said, where does the word Iran come from? What does it mean? And I knew it meant Aryan, or it meant Aryan, but what does that actually mean? Like Aryan, it's misused by Germans, obviously, in World War II. But so we looked it up. We used ChatGPT, which I don't think we're going to have enough time. I wanted to talk a lot about the perils and pitfalls of chat, but I'll wait for your next book, which I assume you're writing as we're talking right now. I just love it. We'll do that another time. But we asked ChatGPT, what's the origin of Aryan? And we kept drilling down into it. And it comes out, the meaning of it in an Indo-European dialect, the meaning of Aryan is nobleman or free person. In other words, Aryans are free people, and they should endeavor, and the Persians and the Iranians, they should endeavor to be free. In Judaism, the word Jew comes from Yehuda, which means Hodea, which means gratitude. You talk a lot.
I love that.
Yeah, you talk a lot in this book. So that Persians or Iranian, I mean, this is not a mandate, but you should at least think about it. Like, we should be noble. We should be free people. And I wish that the Iranian government would practice more freedom, especially for the women that are being subjugated so violently there. But anyway, we're not going to virtue signal too much today. But the point is, who do you give gratitude to? You see an osprey. I find a problem with modern scientists is that most experiences, Lord Rabbi Sachs, who passed away as chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, he said that it's natural when you have a transcendent peak experience to want to give gratitude. You see the Grand Canyon, you see Concord Lake, you see an osprey swooping over your head. You want to give gratitude. It feels so great. And religious people have an outlet. Who do you give gratitude to? Osprey, evolution, Darwin. How do you manifest that sense of gratitude, which is so inculcated in you personally and in your spirit and in the essence of spirituality as you define it?
I have above my desk, I know this is not visual. I don't know whether you can.
Oh, yeah.
You see that?
Yeah, I see that. Oh, I see Salman Rushdie, right?
I have above my desk a poster of about 20 people that I've known in my past who have been influential, who have mentored me. Some of them have passed away now. And every day I look up at that poster and I look at all those faces and I express my gratitude to those people.
Wow. That's amazing. So, my take on Rabbi Sachs's, statement is that we scientists, and now that's very, that was just, I'm blown away by that sentiment, Alan, but just in the interest of time. So the thing that I notice is that we as scientists are, when you saw the, moons of Jupiter, or when you saw a rainbow, when you saw that osprey, you have a very deep scientific knowledge beyond the average person, 10 sigma above, and that's fine. And an average person can experience transcendence. My child can experience it. But when we experience it, in Judaism, there's actually blessings. Like you see a rainbow, you see a meteor shower, you give a blessing because it's so overarching. But when a scientist sees something every single day, I believe they kind of get inured to the sense, like we kind of lose track of, like, we're studying the origin of the universe. We're made of matter, and this matter is comprehending how it came about, possibly. And then we have all these squabbles, and isn't it just like, you get overwhelmed? Like I get very much overwhelmed, and I find it can be paralytic. I feel like you can appreciate beauty so much. My daughter's smile, I'm putting her to bed. I'm like, she's not going to be this age forever. She's not going to want me in the bed with her, when she turns 5 or whatever. Who knows? How do you grapple with that? Can you give my listeners some advice about like how do you handle the blessings? Just even if your life is crap, it's still pretty damn good. How do you handle the blessings of gratitude if you don't have a director, a gift giver to give gratitude to?
Well, I think that it's a wonderful question, and I think that in general that none of us express gratitude enough. And as a scientist, my witness of a rainbow or a wild osprey making eye contact, my scientific understanding of that does not in the slightest diminish my awe. And I love the Buddhist idea of being present, of mindfulness, that if we can learn how to, even if it's only a few minutes a day, just turn off our cell phones, turn off our computers, and just pay attention to the moment. And the moment is so beautiful. We're so lucky to be alive. If you think of it, out of the trillions and trillions of sperm cells and trillions of eggs in your mother, that one of them became you. And all of those other ones never became a living being. Just that fact alone. Life in the universe is incredibly rare. If you look at all the matter in the universe, that the fraction of matter in the universe that is alive is 1/billionth of 1/billionth. It's like 1 grain of sand on the Gobi Desert. So when you think of those things, you realize how lucky and precious life is. And just keeping your eyes open and being mindful for a few moments. That's what I recommend.
Mm-hmm. And it's increasingly been shown to be the case that from brain scientists, far more knowledgeable than I, that, it's giving gratitude in the morning, giving gratitude at night, bullet journaling, however you like, leads to pronounced improvement in mental health and well-being. Alan, the last thing that we've added in the last 2 years since you've been gracing us while your presence on this podcast are the 4 final questions, the final 4 existential questions, not unlike the final 4 of NCAA basketball, which I know the MIT Beavers will be playing the San Diego Tritons in a hotly contested battle. We have.
I doubt it.
So I ask my audience these questions. I don't think I had time to ask you. We only have 5 minutes this time. I'm going to ask you at least. I'll see how many we can get. First one of the existential questions has to do with what you'll put in your ethical will, which is in Hebrew called a zava'ah. These are sort of a template of not material wealth, but spiritual or intellectual or perhaps a wisdom will. What would you leave to your offspring? Not only biological, but also ideological, like the hundreds of thousands of people listening to this podcast.
I don't think we can do better than the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Very good. Richard Feynman said many things, including about consciousness and appreciation and gratitude. He said, in contradistinction to, I think it was Walt Whitman maybe, or whoever wrote the poem, I heard the learned astronomer who was dismayed that the night had been turned to numbers. He said, who am I as a man who cannot appreciate the knowledge of Jupiter just because I know he's made of nitrogen, meaning the planet Jupiter rather than just looking at it. Anyway, Feynman was asked the question, if in some cataclysm, all scientific knowledge were to be destroyed and only one sentence passed to the next generation of creatures, what statement would contain the most information in the fewest words? And this comes back to the hero of the beginning of the story, Lucretius, who mentioned atoms.
I know what he said, atoms.
Atoms, that's right. They're whirling around. Anyway, what would you put, how would you answer the cataclysm question? What single sentence most best encapsulates maybe a little bit of swagger for humanity to have in perpetuity, that we figured out something truly tremendous about the universe since Feynman, perhaps?
The physical universe had a beginning.
Very good, very good. And to that, you can turn to a problem book in general relativity and gravitation, which is, I just love that book, Alan. I'm so glad you wrote it.
Well, thank you.
Next question, third question. I'm not meaning to insult you, although the interview is almost over, so I could get away with it. No. Sir Arthur C. Clarke, who is the namesake of the center that I am the associate director here of, called the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, said, when a distinguished but elderly scientist says something is possible, he is almost certainly right. But when he says something is impossible, he is very probably wrong. I want to ask you, Alan, what thing, topic, conjecture have you been wrong about recently or in the past?
Conjecture have I been wrong about?
Not only scientifically. It could be about your own life, like could or
I've been wrong about many things. Well, let me think. I mean, I've been wrong about so many things that it's hard to think of one particular thing to mention. I think that I was wrong in thinking my wife is a very people-centered person, and she lives in the moment. She's much better in her people relations than I am, and I think that when we first got married, I thought that I would never be able to change my ways and be more of the kind of person that she would be compatible with. And we both have grown closer to each other in our mannerisms and our behavior. So I was wrong about that, and I'm very happy that I was wrong about that.
All right. Well, we're gonna have to send her a copy of this interview, okay, Alan? Last question, the final one. We have 1 minute left. Lastly, going back in time, Arthur C. Clarke said the only way to discover the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. It's the origin of the name of my podcast.
Right.
What mysterious aspect of your life perplexed you at age 20 or 30 and gave you the courage in hindsight to perhaps give yourself advice to that 20-year-old to give yourself the courage to go into the impossible? What advice would you give to your 20, 30-year-old self?
What advice would I give to my 20-year-old self?
Yes, to give you that courage.
Well, these are profound questions, and it's hard to quickly come up with answers.
Don't worry, you've got 10 seconds.
Okay, right. I think I would tell myself that you can fall in love with more than one person.
Ah, wow. And that could even be with a mind, with a conscious mind, or a spiritual being, a God.
Right.
Well, Alan, we're in love with your mind and your writing, and you're welcome back here anytime. I'm going to pass the interview on to Andre. He's going to come on, and I'm going to ask you in a few minutes or weeks or whatever, please send me a question for Andre. That would be a lovely touch. Alan, thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom. And it's such a pleasure. Thank you for your contribution to our intellectual rapaciousness and slaking our hunger for a little bit.
You're a great intellect yourself, Brian, and it's really a pleasure to have conversation with you. I learn a lot by talking to you. Thank you.
I love it. Thank you, Alan. Have a great day.